are recent reports by the International Energy Agency. Their last 2 or 3 annual reports, they say flat out that we're at this moment now where we will have renewable energies, and that's the direction things are going.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, and today I'm going to be talking to Imre Zeman and Mark Apollonio about communicating on climate change after climate denialism. We're also going to be chatting a little bit about corporate sustainability goals and in general how we can better communicate on these issues with people who may live in petrocultures. Before we jump into that, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us. And finally, if you happen to be listening to this before October 3rd, 2024, do come out to our town hall meeting on climate change in Cornerburg, Newfoundland and Labrador. That's on October 3rd, 7 p.m. at Brute Lake Brew Co., 92 West Street in Cornerbrook, NL. Imre, Mark, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for inviting us. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Connor. It's a pleasure.
For those tuning in, can you give a brief intro to who you are and what it is that you do?
Sure, I'll start if that's okay, Mark. So my name is Imre Zeman. I'm the inaugural director of the Institute for Environment, Conservation, and Sustainability at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. So Scarborough is one of the 3 campuses of the University of Toronto. This institute serves all 3 campuses despite being located at one of them physically. I'm also somebody that started a group called Petrocultures. And in that role, and I think also in my role as director of the Institute, what I do is I do research that focuses on the social cultural dimensions of energy and energy transition, and try to look at the implications of the degree to which our actions, our practices, our habits over the last 175 years, the degree to which they're saturated in oil, what that means for our capacity to move beyond them.
I'm a podcast producer for a company called Cited Media, put together a podcast called Cited Podcast. We have worked with Imre and another academic on a team before to talk about sort of utopian thinking in the environmental movement and elsewhere for a series for our former podcast called Darts and Letters. Now we've sort of rebranded a Cited Podcast. We're working once again with Imre on a series of podcast episodes, and I'm also helping Imre put together the series of panels that we're talking with you today.
And Imre, I've actually attended a Petrocultures conference many, many years ago. I think this was in 2015, something like that, in St. John's. I remember a very interesting event, great chance to talk to a lot of people. Cited as well. We've recently been listening to your short series, I should say, on the Exxon Valdez spill. So it's kind of interesting to be talking to you both in one place. You have an upcoming event entitled Climate Communication After Climate Denialism, and as clearly both people who work in that field, what is this event about and what are you hoping to get out of it?
I can once again start. I guess there's 3 things that I want to get out of it. One of them is just to announce this new institute to the Toronto community, but also to people interested in the environment wherever they might be. These series of events will be live streamed. They'll also be hopefully recorded and put up on YouTube and put up on our website. One of the main focuses of the Institute is on climate communication and how that can result in social change, but also in public policy. So it's kind of one of the 3 areas. We're kind of exemplifying one of our commitments. I suppose another thing is it's a provocation. So when I have said the title of this series to some of my colleagues and to some people in my condo building who are not academics, I said, we're doing something on climate communication after climate denialism. Please come to it. The first thing they'll always say is, what do you mean? There's lots of climate denialism, or have we actually moved past this moment of climate denialism? And I have to agree, there's certainly a lot of denialism out there in the Canadian context, which is surprising, perhaps this deep into these discussions around climate change. And of course, oil companies will push back, lots of people will push back. But even so, I would still say that we're in new territory, that a certain kind of climate denialism that we were familiar with 20 years ago, 10 years ago, let's say even 5 years ago, is disappearing. And that we have a situation in which there's broader and broader public agreement because of climate-induced weather events, whether because there's been lots of discussion about climate change. Publics accept more and more that climate change exists. So do, one of the things we're going to be talking about, so do corporations. This is part of the types of things that they discuss. It's part of their annual reports. They're eager to be seen kind of on the right side of history when it comes to climate change. Whether or not they're actually modifying their practices to fit their claims is another issue. But I think some corporations are doing that. But I think one of the things I turn to when I try to talk to people about this kind of moment where we're past climate denialism are recent reports by the International Energy Agency. Their last 2 or 3 annual reports, they say flat out that we're at this moment now where we will have renewable energies, and that's the direction things are going. That will have more electricity by 2030 in the world than is right now produced in the entire US grid. But they stated that global fossil fuel use has risen alongside GDP since the start of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. Putting this rise into reverse while continuing to expand the global economy will be a pivotal moment in energy history. So the IEA, which was set up following the 1973 oil crisis to represent energy companies, but also national economies that depend on energy, they're saying now that renewables are going to be what rules the day. So whatever kind of pushback there might be, I think that pushback on the part of companies even indicates that we have a new thing coming. And I'll just say one other thing about the way we've designed this series, and that is one of the reasons we're doing it, is that we want publics to talk about communication, the difficulties of communication, communicating climate, even after you have these institutional actors agreeing that it's there. Communicating it in a way that gets across the urgency for action and for significant change and real change. And the way we've designed this series, that is going to happen at a university, we make sure that it's not just university-based researchers that are part of it. So we've invited the author John Valiant to come. In the panels that we have always a journalist, somebody working off campus on climate events and on climate communication, and then a researcher. So these are kind of the 3 things: getting publics connected to a broad range of views about climate communication and its challenges, this provocation to say that climate communication is in this other mode. Maybe even it's a provocation to those that really attend to climate change and the difficulty of climate communication. And also just to say, hey, this new institute is here. It's ready to do interesting kinds of work that I hope are not the same kinds of things, doing the same kinds of things that other environmental organizations are already doing.
I think another important provocation is maybe the people who were never in the denialist camp, but I think for a large portion of the population, there is just a sort of like, we have subsumed this belief that we are moving inexorably and inevitably towards sustainability and things are going to be all right because there are adults in the room who are going to fix the problems. And that's been falling short for decades. And so what do you do about this portion of the population that knows there's an issue, but hasn't actually been mobilized to, whether it's like vote or like, whatever their political priorities, their commercial priorities as consumers, get mobilized to like see that this is a crisis.
Right. And I think actually part of the flip side of that is that, ironically, for those people who have been hoping that, or even for people who have really tried for activism to make a difference, one thing I do encounter is this feeling of a complete hopelessness because, well, nobody in the room is taking charge and really making sure that things are being done. Or at least there's the perception nobody is in the room. I would argue we've actually seen some good climate successes thanks to activists in the last few years that are important, that are good wins that we should actually be celebrating. But you see that apathy or feeling of defeatedness sometimes, I think, even amongst the environmentally aware. And then that makes it even harder to reach out to those people beyond that group, right? Because ultimately, one thing I know from a lot of other communication studies is what actually convinces people who maybe are on that climate denial spectrum is talking to their neighbors and to their friends and to their family. And if the motivated environmentalist and their family doesn't feel motivated to go talk to them, well, then we've got a bit of a problem, I guess. If they're either if they're just waiting for somebody in power to make change, or because they just personally feel so heartbroken about the situation, they can't go out and talk to family and talk to friends.
A lot of studies have indicated that past a certain point, when you recognize the seriousness of climate change and its significance for the inhabitants of the planet, for people, for non-humans, the more you know that, at a certain point, you become more apathetic. It's kind of the inverse of what you'd hope. And I think what that hinges is that there's this sense, I guess a twofold sense. One is that what comes with this recognition is this realization that urgency matters. So this isn't something to be addressed over a century. And I think people can look back and say, well, there have been lots of developments over a very long period of time. And so perhaps in this case, there could be the level of changes and the depth of the changes to existing practices, economic, political, cultural, that there have been in the past. Whatever they're choosing to base that on is another issue. But they know that that's not going to do it. And they know that there hasn't been the level of action that there should be. And so they wonder if that's ever going to happen. I think we're also at this moment where recognition of climate change comes with other kinds of social change that impede moving with that urgency. So some of that is just misinformation, whether things are real or not real. Easy for those who want to engage in denialism to muddy the waters. It comes with a certain level of this moment of political disintegration. So the fact that climate change would come to awareness at the same time as we have populism springing up around the world, or we have political systems that can't move very quickly, is another reason why there might be some hopelessness.
Wouldn't something as sort of nuts and bolts as inflation play into that? I mean, populism and political sense of detachment right now is stemming, at least in part, from inequality, from seeing the upper echelons get ever richer while one individual in the middle classes or working classes, their buying power is just going down. And so worrying about whether you're going to transition to solar power when they are just worrying about filling their car tank with an ever increasing gas price is going to stymie them going, okay, this is something I want to get passionate about.
I think that's an excellent point. What would then be required if that's an issue is some kind of clear identification of the ways in which those who are not at the top earning level can benefit from this transition if they don't have to bear the costs. And that too has proven to be difficult to get across. Like, so certainly I think the statistics are that those in the 1% of earners, not just in wealth, but of income earners, use 4 times as much electricity as those like everyone else. So there's certainly kind of an injustice around that. There are mechanisms to try to address that. I would say the carbon tax in Canada is one of them. But the idea that it's a tax has been wildly unpopular amongst people who are struggling to put food in their fridges, even though they benefit from that tax.
Well, I was going to say, even though the rebate system, again, over 400 economists have come out saying that it is giving more back to lower and middle income families. And the irony, I think, in some ways, that we are attacking one of the few mechanisms in Canada that actually does directly redistribute cash back to, like, it's funny because to me, the emphasis for climate action has always been on big corporations, on big industry, right? So when I first heard about the carbon tax, my first thought was, okay, because I didn't understand the rebate system. My first thought was, I don't particularly like this. And then I heard about the rebate system, and weirdly enough, I ended up supporting the idea of a carbon tax, not really because I thought, I mean, great if it makes a big impact for the environment, fantastic if the consumer carbon tax does that. I know the industrial one does, but actually because, oh, here's a redistributive tax, and I personally support those, and I supported the idea that gave money directly back to people. That seemed like a cool concept to me from a totally different angle of social justice and not actually as much to do with the environment. So it's kind of interesting that in this situation that we're in, super high inflation, people are struggling. There's a lot of people out there maybe attacking one of the few things that actually is doing the inverse of what's happening.
But maybe you're right, Mark, in the sense all those things fold in together. If you have governments that are really in the pockets of corporations that are neoliberal, that continue to put money towards corporations, even in this kind of shift to renewables, all of the money that's been transferred to the development of battery plants, for instance, to private industry from public coffers. If you have that less money for public goods, these things again make it more difficult for precisely the reasons you say to back climate change initiatives. I suppose the thing to do, kind of just to kind of follow up on what you're saying, Connor, is if the message is you need to put solar panels on your house, that's not going to work unless you make the programs available to do that. Things like rebate systems, things like even making things free, but that hasn't been the way that these things have been developed for the most part. They've been put out there, and the impetus has been put on individuals to at least co-fund them, and that hasn't worked. I mean, I just can say that one of the studies that a group of us have done is on home rebate systems for housing retrofits. Housing retrofit systems, which exist now in Canada, where you get free loans, like 0% loans to do the things you want to do to your house, as long as they fit using renewable energy or reducing the carbon load of your house. What we have seen over and over again is these systems, once again, are used by top wage earners. Who wouldn't want free money? Like, you don't have to pay interest to work on your house. It doesn't, $40,000, you still have to pay back some of it, whether it's interest free or not. And that's not the first place people are going to go if what they're going to get back is lower energy, but over a very long cycle. It's going to take a very long time for them to earn back that money just from lowering their energy costs. And it becomes even more difficult to get this across in places like Ontario or Quebec or other places where already electricity is, relatively speaking, cheap and already not based on fossil fuels. So all of this stuff it's kind of a dangerous mix at this moment to get this message across. And again, I'll kind of reiterate, and Connor, you said it too in a different context, like everybody is a very big thing to say, but let's say more than 50%, far more than 50% in most countries of people agree there's climate change. What comes next is a muddy, unclear path forward with lots of different possibilities, all of them seeming right now to run into various kinds of headwinds. But I also agree, Connor, that to get to this point, the efforts that have been undertaken by the environmental movement over the last half century or even longer, we would not be at this point if that work didn't happen. The front page of the most conservative newspaper in Canada daily has articles about climate change or about energy transition or about the need to change our practices. This is true of other newspapers as well. The Wall Street Journal talks about this. So this isn't a hidden development that is treated as bizarre, as something that is not something you need to do. What is unclear is who's going to pay for it. What is the right direction forward? Who's going to own renewables? Who's going to benefit from it? Because it certainly just isn't the public. This isn't something guided by governments who are, at least right now, committed to creating changes socially and politically and economically, which will enable energy transition in a way that is just, in a way that attends to those kinds of differences right now in terms of salary, capacity, to individually address your load on systems, on environmental systems. We're at an odd moment, I suppose.
Sorry, Connor, I have a question for you guys, and I know Connor's supposed to be asking the questions, but as a podcaster, I'm just sort of living out my nature. All this stuff we're talking about goes back to a question from the beginning, and also perhaps will be some ideation for a panelist for our third panel, which has not been we haven't figured out the sort of panel structure, the makeup of the panel yet. And that's that, like, talking about the urgency of it. It's on the front page and all that kind of thing. And then talking about communicating the urgency to the public at large. And that's what we're trying to do in the panel and that kind of thing. I wonder, Extinction Rebellion, from my sort of layperson's anecdotal perspective, does not have a good reputation. I know people who are like, could think of themselves as politically progressive and stuff like that, who are like, ooh, they're like, why would they, block a bridge in London? Like, that's just so disrespectful, disruptive. Like, they're just sort of like these cringy weirdos or something. I think that's a pretty commonly held view. At least that's what I've interpreted. What's with that?
I would like to respond to, in general, sort of some of the more radical statements environmental groups come out with, and sort of maybe that other form of advocacy. I think one problem, and it's funny because I've been in conversations not too long ago directly about this. When an organization, like any organization, ours, just because of the way these things work, if I post to social media and just leave the post there, it's going to the same 5 people who probably already agree with what I'm saying, right? With a lot of the comms that, frankly, I see in the environmental movement, what has historically been done is it's going to the same people. Now, that's useful if you're getting those people to go out and talk to other people, right? But if that's where that stops, and you're not also doing the sort of communications to the non-standard groups who aren't fully convinced yet, who aren't part of your movement, who you're going to need to understand where they're coming from, because they don't see the world like you do, and they don't have the same priorities. And I think it's down to as simple as, like, who do you hang out with in your spare time? Is it only other environmentalists? Well, sorry, but you're not going to know how to communicate with anybody else if that's what you're doing, right? Like, if that's the way that you socialize, even that has an impact. I think there is often a well-meaning, but a mistake that has happened in environmentalism, where we are communicating to the same people over and over again, who are the people who already agree. Great people, great conversations to have. But the reality is, we don't win the big climate fights if that's where we stay and that's where the only people we talk to. At the very least, if we're not trying to say to those people, hey, bring your friends, bring people who aren't on side with this, and let's chat with them about this. Let's have conversations. Let's open a dialogue. On the flip side of that, yeah, there are people out there with whom I'm never going to be able to convince. And there's no point in trying to, because they just hate my guts, and that's wasted time. But there's a lot of people on the fence. And honestly, like, I tend to think most of our communications efforts as a movement should be there. But I'm the host, so I'm going to stop giving an answer to a question now. And Imra, do you want to take a run at that?
Well, as host, isn't there also this opportunity to have a dialogue and a discussion and so on? I guess I have 2 things to that to say to that, and maybe one of them is in this in relation to this idea of being past climate denialism. I think some of those kinds of actions that defined the environmental movement are much more so in the past, honestly. So, like, breaking down equipment that was for logging, or tying oneself to trees, being up in a tree for 2 years. One activist famous. Extinction Rebellion, I don't think is particularly active right now at the level that it once was. All of those, to me, are actions to try to provoke a discussion, and even just to provoke, to put this into discussion. And maybe those are the wrong kinds of actions now, if we are at this different moment. Like, if the point is to try to get governments, let's just say, to recognize climate change, I think that's happened. And now we are at a different moment. I think Connor is right. If we are, I will just say, if we are at a different moment, and perhaps this was always the case, then there needs to be now a discussion with those groups and those people that either aren't on board yet, or those that believe it but don't yet know what that might mean for what comes next, or are afraid that it might mean, well, I think always the issue is that there's some kind of loss to what they can do. There's a loss of liberty. There's a loss of capacity to live their lives the way they want. There's always this kind of sense that doing something in relationship to the environment, because the language is about taking from the environment, impacting the climate, means cutting back. And that's threatening, especially to those people that already have too little. So I think that this is the moment for a different kind of discussion, for a more nuanced discussion. And I agree, there is not necessarily that taking place. And I'm hoping that this event will do some of that kind of work. I think it'll still be limited, perhaps. I will say, however, though, that I'm at least being serious enough about this to go on AM radio station on Monday, which is not listened to by environmentalists. And we're the listeners on that AM station who are, they want some ideas. They're interested in some ideas as they drive to work. And what they want, though, is not to be told not to be driving to work. They don't really have an option about that. They want some ideas about what might come next, and they are interested in what might unfold. They just need some sense of their capacity and the capacity of their political systems to do a kind of work that hasn't been evidenced so far. At least not to, again, there's a question of urgency, at least not to the degree that it's happened so far. Maybe urgency is the wrong language as well. I think there's kind of a sense of a threat. And I think there definitely is status quo ways that things will have to change. That is treated as dangerous. That is treated as an offense. But we have seen status quo ways of things change, whether it's something as simple as women being able to work, have the option to work or to go to university, or for there being a greater number of people across the class spectrum being able to have higher education. As late as 1980, in the UK and France, I think perhaps less in the US, only about 20% of people went to universities to get bachelor's degrees. It's up around 60% in France. That's an incredible change over a very short amount of time. And that's just kind of treated as normal. So I think there's an opportunity here. I think it just has to be taken. Now, if you are having a pipeline put through your territory, if you are an indigenous community and you have never agreed to it, and it's being put through there because of eminent domain. So there are still places there where something has to happen quickly, but that's in a very specific situation. It's not kind of making this big claim that I think environmentalists often will make.
I do want to get to a few more of the questions before we leave today, because we are running out of time a little bit. One of the panels at this upcoming event that you've got is called Corporate Environmental Social Governance, or ESG, Greenwashing or Progress. I'm curious where you land on that subject. It seems to me there are lots of companies out there making green claims, and it's probably not a clear-cut answer. We're actually just finished recording another episode that looks directly into the positive stories of ESG and like what defines good ESG and how we should measure it, and lots of interesting questions like that. But in terms of maybe the oil and gas industry specifically, you might want to chat to this or other corporations. I'm curious where you fall on that subject.
Well, I'm really pleased to hear that you're doing something about positive ESG. Again, I think the tendency is to fall on the greenwashing side of things. I myself get suspicious when I see major mining companies release sustainability reports. I'm curious what they're trying to do. I don't think it's always just cynical. And the very fact that they have to start to account for that is compelling to me. Again, I'm not always on the side that everything is doomed and we're not going anywhere and so on. I think the oil industry sees that its days they're not going to be around for much longer. By much, I don't mean a decade or 2 decades. Probably it'll be longer than that. And they want to make sure and are taking actions, whatever actions are necessary. They're going at multiple fronts to continue to retain some legitimacy in the eyes of the public and in the eyes of government, that they matter. They matter. Well, what types of things have they done? Sometimes they've used the language of nationalism. They matter because they're part of what creates in Canada the Canadian spirit. Canadian oil is great. We've heard this since the articulation of ethical oil in 2010, 2011, and all the way up to the Ontario Pathways Alliance revitalizing this, right? Canadian oil is better than oil from Saudi Arabia and other places where there are totalitarian governments, rah, Canadian oil. There are more sophisticated ways of addressing this. So you have something like the Pathways Alliance, which is made up of the major oil producing companies that take energy out of the tar sands. I think that the companies who are involved in it extract 95% of the oil from the tar sands. And in their case, they are speaking to the virtues of decarbonizing the atmosphere. So again, that is a recognition that they're not long for the industry, or they have to do something. And they have this particular way of figuring out how to deal with consumption, not with the production side, with like what happens with consumption. Interestingly, when you have carbon capture and storage, it means that you understand that carbon is doing something to the environment, and you have to do something. You have to convince people that there's ways of doing it while keeping your business going. There's some investment in other kinds of energy systems by these companies. But I think what they're doing now is, whether they're using greenwashing or political pressure, they're trying to get as much return on the infrastructure that they've developed, very expensive infrastructure, as they can while they're able to. And it's a ever shortening amount of time because of how inexpensive renewables are becoming. And again, how legitimate renewables are becoming. So it's a political game, but I think they do see that they're on the way out. I don't think that they see that fossil fuels are going to be on everybody's lips and what everybody wants to pursue 50 years from now, whatever kind of political changes happen. And I guess I would put it like that. Again, I don't want to completely rule out that the fossil industry has some attention to ESG. If there's any kind of level of corporation that is least attentive to that, it is the oil and gas industry.
And I'll just note on that, like, one of the things that we're running into is we're advocating for this emissions cap on oil and gas corporations in Canada. And really, in its current form, what that would do is hold them to the very base promises that they actually made. We will reduce emissions by this much, right? And inside of our corporate activities. And corporations are acting like toddlers. They're going out. The CEOs and executives are saying, oh, no, sorry, all those things that we promised, we don't want to do those because it might hurt like our massive profits. And that's pretty much it. Like even then, very minimally, ultimately, as it's turning out. So yeah, I guess I fall into that camp too of if people are going to make green claims, I think there should at least be some sort of accountability for it, even if it is the oil and gas industry, even if it is oil and gas corporations that I personally disagree with on a lot of other fronts. If they're going to make these claims, then that should be the base level. So another panel that you have is petropopulism versus just transition. We talked a little bit about this earlier in the podcast. We definitely see some people associating themselves with the oil and gas industry as if it's a matter of patriotism, because I can understand actually industry, right? I can understand if you see yourself as a member of an industry, but to associate yourself with the messaging of these corporations, they don't really care about anybody, right? At the end of the day, I don't believe for a second that really any corporation that I've ever encountered is like super dedicated to like its workers on the bottom level, right? Like maybe with some exceptions, that there are some exceptions.
Yeah.
But it's at the same time, the idea of that just transition is saying can sometimes seem vague to people. I'm curious, what do you think about this face-off? We discussed that a bit, so I'm also curious, like, with this panel, what are you hoping to get, and what's the discussion going to be about?
Just as you're describing that, Connor, I was thinking back to this incredibly vivid few passages. I think it's in John Valiant's book in Fireweather. He describes the world, the culture that exists in Fort McMurray, and he does so with a lot of grace. In this book, he describes the culture within the fossil fuels community is such that, like, if you go to a bar and you work for, I think it's Syncrude is probably like maybe the top-notch firm, or there's firms that are operating up there, and there's the one that is the sort of gold standard, and you get the best pay, and these are the often the guys with the fanciest trucks. And when you go to the bar with a bunch of other people, you wear your colors of your like company or your company patch on your jacket on the outside, and it's like a status thing. And apparently even for like meeting potential spouses, girlfriends, boyfriends, or partners, whatever, this is like a thing that people take pride in. And so I just think, that seems, if you're not part of that culture, it seems quite wild. But, I was also speaking to Mark Blythe, the political economist, who is comparing the sort of like world of fossil fuels to the world of like lobster fishermen on the East Coast. I mean, these are political third rails that aren't touched by parties because the culture is deep, and like to not understand that is like very important facet of these people's lives is to misunderstand like these people.
Mm-hmm. It is. So just to follow up on that, it is very confusing to me, the ways in which nationalism has been tied to this particular resource extraction. Like, again, if you think about other types of industries, there's no kind of national fervor connected to them. Like, I don't know anywhere in the world where they're like, we love nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is the spirit of Japan, or something like this. It's specific to oil and gas. I think it's the outcome of decades of trying to make this link between a certain lifestyle, a certain kind of practice associated with extraction and place, and this sense again of a fear of a status quo coming apart. I think it's also related to elites, this sense that elites don't understand what it is that you are about, and a sense that you don't get to participate in certain parts of the culture. I saw a little bit of there's a little quick YouTube that you can find of David Graeber describing really quickly why there would be some suspicion of elites by a lot of people. So the ability of somebody who leaves high school not having done very, very well, the chance that they might become a university professor is unbelievably small. The chance in the US that they might go into the military and can go into the military is very high. That's open to them. It's open to them as well to go into industry. So there are connections that they have there and sense of opportunity there that they just don't have elsewhere. And of course, they would see it with suspicion. But they still have a link to the nation. They still love Canada. And when there's a threat that something is going to be taken away from you, and again, however vague that is, it produces this other kind of possibility. And I think that began in the Canadian case in the 1980s with imposition, or the attempt to impose the national energy policy, has continued up to this day, when you can buy shirts that say, I love Alberta oil, I love Canadian oil, or, often they're Canada. They're not just separatists. They're kind of saying that there's a kind of an us versus them. We know the right kind of Canada. Certainly you see this in as well, this kind of the idea that there's a kind of an America of an earlier moment when there's coal extraction. That was the real America. And the link to that particular kind of practice is definitely there. And maybe I'll just say one other thing. You'd asked about energy justice or just transition. I think that one is an easy thing to say. I don't know if they're exactly linked, but there's energy poverty for many, many people. For, I think, 15% of households in the US spend more than 10% of their income on energy. There are gaps between countries about the amount of energy that they have access to. Between Canada, which is a very, very high energy use country per capita, and say Cambodia, I think the ratio is about 20-1. So any kind of transition is going to have to attend to the fact that some people got access to incredible amounts of energy during petro-modernity to build up their countries, to build up GDP, and some didn't. If you were kind of like to graph GDP and energy use, they map onto one another very, very very, very tightly.
It's interesting you mentioned that accessibility, because my own dad worked in the oil and gas industry as a young man, and part of that was it was a job he could go earn money, and it was accessible to anybody. And so I think one thing that we have to think about when we're an environmentalist, which ironically, like environmentalists out there who do earn a lot of money or go do speaking tours and all that kind of stuff, right? Like they exist. It's the minority of the people that I know. Most environmentalists, they often don't own homes, right? They often actually have, ironically, not had access to work that has given them a lot, despite sometimes having advanced degrees. But I get where that desire to have access to that capacity comes from, to have access to the ability to support yourself and your family. Very quickly before we go, the next two events are on October 16th and November 13th. How can people find out more?
The easiest thing to do is to go to UTSC, so it's University of Toronto Scarborough, UTSC Environment, all one word, .ca. It'll take you to the events.
Imre, Mark, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks very much.
Thanks
Thanks for the questions.
Hi everyone, Connor Curtis jumping in here to do the Q&A for today's episode, and I want to chat in today's Q&A about a question we've seen a lot out there and have gotten a few times, which is, if Canada is not responsible for a large portion of the world's emissions, why should we do anything on climate change? And to start off, that's actually incorrect. So, Canadians have some of the highest per person emissions in the world. And this is actually how you measure a country's progress on climate change. You can't do it by the overall emissions of the country, because that wouldn't actually be fair. So if you compare Canada to, say, a country of 10 billion people that actually has much lower emissions per person than Canada does, well, those people in that larger country have done a lot more per person to lower their emissions. They've actually made more progress than we have, because for the population that they have much lower emissions. So it's not actually accurate to say that Canada isn't a contributor to global climate change, because for the amount of emissions that we produce, we have very high per person emissions. It's also not fair to say that this is the fault of individual Canadians. So individual Canadians have actually done quite a bit to lower their emissions. Other sectors in Canada have actually done quite a bit to lower emissions. Our consistent reason for having high per person emissions is very specifically oil and gas corporations that have not done their work to keep their emissions in line, that have not done even very basic things they could have done cheaply to keep their emissions low. This is the main reason why we have very high per person emissions that we continue to see every year, why we fail to make progress on that. The other thing that makes this statement inaccurate is that Canada has also been reliant upon oil and gas and has developed those resources for a lot longer than a lot of other nations. So we have historic emissions that go back a long time. We've contributed more over time to climate crisis than a lot of other countries have. And so there is also with that an impetus on us to make more progress. And these aspects of progress shouldn't be just seen as a burden. Reducing emissions doesn't have to necessarily be a burdenous thing. In many cases, as with a lot of the corporations that we have, it's actually about them basically doing often the bare minimum to actually reduce their emissions, but actually getting them to do that can be incredibly difficult. The other thing that we have to think about as a country is that when we do reduce emissions, not only do we send an example to the rest of the world saying this is possible, look, we had high per capita emissions and we've managed to lower them, but that also spurs a whole bunch of technological innovation and other solutions to climate change that are then exportable to other places. So actually, Canada doing more on emissions is not only good for Canada, but it's also good for the rest of the world, because there are actually examples then we can say, hey, listen, take a look at this. We managed to do this with this technology, or we managed to do this by instituting this policy. These are things that actually other people can learn from. So there's another aspect to this story too, which is very hyper-local to Canada. And that's that actually a lot of Canadians suffer from emissions directly. Without talking about climate change, without talking about doing our part to help save the world, let's just chat about the emissions we generate in Canada. So a good example of this is if we put a strong emissions cap on oil and gas corporations, we could save over 4,000 Canadian lives over a decade just from reductions in ambient air pollution. This isn't climate change. This isn't talking about the end impact of those emissions. That's just talking about the immediate impact. We know that a lot of people in Canada already suffer from severe medical issues because of these emissions. And we know that from air quality monitoring work actually Sierra Club Canada has done, just how dangerous these immediate emissions can be. So when we reduce oil and gas emissions, when we reduce emissions from fossil fuel burning sources, when we manage to bring down our own emissions, it's not just a benefit for the world, it's not just a benefit for climate change, it's also very beneficial for us. And that does have a dollar impact as well. I mean, that same study by the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, which looked at the emissions cap and the benefit to people's lives that it could have, also found that it could save us billions in terms of actual medical costs that we have to pay out. Again, that's not counting climate change, that's just ambient air pollution. So it's not fair or accurate to say that Canada doesn't have a huge role to play in climate change globally. It's also not fair or accurate to say that acting on emissions reduction would actually cost us. In many ways, that would be very beneficial for us, and not just in terms of economics, but also in terms of Canadian lives. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues like these by visiting sierraclub.ca with tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us. And a quick note that if you're listening to this before October 3rd, do check out our town hall meeting on climate change in Corner Brook, Newfoundland and Labrador. That's on October 3rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. at Bootleg Brew Co. 92 West Street in Corner Brook.